This is a portrait of a remarkable woman, one of a family of remarkable women. It is a portrait intended to display her status, to reflect her talents and qualities, to convey something of her physical presence and her personality, and to immortalize her love for her husband. It was painted in 1804, when the sitter was 25 years old. She was a Spanish aristocrat, and her name was María Tomasa Palafox y Portocarrero, Marquesa de Villafranca. The artist who painted her was Francisco de Goya. By the first years of the 19th century, Goya, by then in his 40s, was a successful and well-established artist. He had been an official artist of the Spanish royal court since 1786, and had held the well-rewarded and prestigious position of first court painter since 1790. As a portraitist to the royal, the noble, and the socially prominent, he was known for his psychological perceptiveness, his genius at capturing character, his acute observation and depiction of telling detail, his respect for the individuality and dignity of his subjects, but also his refusal to flatter them. From the 1790s he was constantly in demand as a fashionable portrait painter, although his subjects never quite knew what they were going to get. A serious illness left him profoundly deaf, which may partly account for the distinctive character of many of his portraits, simultaneously profound and disconnected, revealing and yet enigmatic. Goya painted a large number of portraits, about 160 being known today, and many of his works from the 1780s and early 1790s are reasonably well documented in his correspondence and records. Once we get into the 19th century, the documentation is much sparser, and as a result, we rarely know much about the circumstances around the painting of any particular portrait from this period. Such is the case with this portrait from 1804. We do not know the circumstances under which it was painted, only that it was exhibited at the annual exhibition of the Spanish Royal Fine Arts Academy, the Real Academia de Bellas Artes de San Fernando, in 1805. We do know something of the sitter, however, and that both she and her family were well known to Goya, who painted several members of the family over the years. María Tomasa Palafox was born in 1780, the third daughter of María Francisca de Sales Portocarrero, Countess of Montijo. The Countess, born in 1754, had 6 children who survived to adulthood, 4 daughters and 2 sons. She was a highly educated and intelligent woman, deeply engaged in the culture of the Spanish Enlightenment, with strong interests in education, religious reform, the welfare of children, and the status of women. She was a key figure on the Junta de Damas de Honor y Mérito, the state-approved council for women's affairs, and ran perhaps the most celebrated and influential salon in Madrid. The city of Madrid was undergoing rebuilding and improvement in the latter half of the 18th century, and had a vigorous intellectual and cultural life, in which many aristocratic women, such as the Countess of Montijo, through their salons, their patronage, and their involvement in civic life, played a prominent role. The English traveller Elizabeth, Lady Holland, knew the Countess and wrote that she was regarded as the cleverest and best informed woman in Spain. Her society is the best in Madrid. The Countess remained an influential and well-connected figure until around 1798, when she fell out of favour with the government of the day. She was accused of sympathizing with the religious movement of Jansenism, although it was her association with the political opposition which was the real reason for the government's hostility, and she was banned from court, banished to Logroño in northern Spain, where she remained for the rest of her life. With her concern for the status of women and the importance of female education, the Countess of Montijo naturally ensured that her daughters were highly educated and prepared to follow her example and play a full role in the society and culture of their time. This group portrait from around 1795 to 7, unfortunately only available in a monochrome photograph, shows the Countess with her 4 daughters. She is in the centre, working at an embroidery frame. Her eldest daughter, Maria Ramona, who was a painter and exhibited at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts, is on her right. On her left, looking out at the viewer, is her youngest daughter, Maria Benita de los Dolores, who became a tutor to the royal household, but was also known as the Noble Republican because of her liberal political views. Standing behind their mother are Maria Gabriela, who was constantly in trouble with the Inquisition for her radical religious opinions and was briefly imprisoned in 1821 on suspicion of conspiring against the government, and, on her right, Maria Tomasa, the subject of Goya's portrait. Lady Holland wrote that Maria Tomasa was the closest of the four girls to her mother in appearance and character, and in many ways she followed in her mother's footsteps, being concerned with social issues and particularly problems affecting women and children. Like her mother, she was an important and very active figure on the Women's Council, later serving as the council's president. In 1798 she married Francisco de Borja Alvarez de Toledo, brother of the Duke of Medina Sidonia and a career military officer. Through her marriage, Maria Tomasa became the sister-in-law of the Duchess of Alba. She was also a cousin of the famous General José Palafox, who achieved fame in the fighting that followed the French invasion of Spain. Both the Duchess and the General were well known to Goya, who painted them both many times. The couple had 9 children, of whom 7 survived to adulthood. The marriage was a highly suitable and beneficial one for 2 noble families of such high status, but it was also a love match. During the years of war and political tumult following Napoleon's invasion, Maria was active in patriotic causes, but also became associated, through her husband, with the agitation that led to the abdication of Carlos IV and the taking of the Spanish throne by Fernando VII, but that is far too complicated a story to tell here. More relevant to this painting is that she was also very active in the arts, and was herself a painter and a member of the Royal Academy of Fine Arts. Sadly, none of her work appears to survive, although it is possible that the portrait of her husband, which we saw earlier, may be by her. The artist is unknown. As an aristocrat, she did not take commissions or sell her work, but it is evident that she took her artistic activities seriously, and that for her painting was more than merely a genteel recreation. Not least, she had mastered the art of painting in oils. Accordingly, the most immediately striking thing about this portrait of her by Goya is that it shows her as a painter, with brush and marlstick in her hands, and her other brushes and palette on a small table by her side, and a portrait underway on the easel in front of her. It was clearly important to Maria Tomasa that she be depicted as a painter, and that the portrait within the portrait, that of her husband, be included. This is, in a sense, a double portrait, although only one of the subjects is present in person, the other being represented by a portrait within the portrait, a device which fitted naturally into Goya's approach of placing his sitters within their own isolated volumes of space. There is a connection here between the 2 subjects, though, created through the dynamic of the gaze. The conceit is that her husband is posing for her off canvas to the left. Her eyes are looking in that direction, past her easel, so that she is gazing at him, and, via his portrait, he gazes back at her. These interlocking gazes bind together the binary and symmetrical arrangement of the easel and portrait on the left, balanced by the Marquesa in her chair on the right. The paler tones of the Marquesa's dress react against the darker red-brown of the background to create a flickering energy that animates the whole, accentuated by the placing of the sitter at an angle to claim the foreground of the picture space. This is a high-status portrait, depicting its subject full length on a large canvas nearly 2 meters tall. Goya has used a fairly coarse weave linen canvas, which was usually his preferred material, and has prepared it with reddish underpainting, which shows through the often thin overpainting and gives the whole picture a warmth of tone. There is little sense of the room in which the figure is placed, or the recession of space behind her, the background consisting of roughly painted shades of reddish-brown, again an approach typical of Goya, which both accentuates the importance of his sitters and creates around them a sense of isolation in space. The figure of the Marchesa, her clothing and the chair she sits in are all painted with freedom and vigour. She sits on a capacious and richly gilded armchair upholstered in red silk brocade, with a large cushion in the same material serving as a footstool. It is hardly likely that she would really have sat in such a chair to paint, or sat so far from her canvas, but both chair and posture reflect what is suitable to someone of her social rank and noble status, rather than what might be considered practical. The same applies to her clothes. When painting, Maria Tomasa would certainly have worn simpler clothes, and an apron or other protective garment, such as the smock French artist Adélaïde Binat is wearing over her gown in this portrait of 1796 by Marie-Geneviève Bouillard. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, female artists were almost always depicted in fashionable, elegant, and feminine attire rather than their working clothes, and the fact that Binat is shown in this way is unusual, but for the Marchesa, a Spanish aristocrat, to be painted in working attire would not be merely unusual, but unthinkable. Her clothes are fashionable and sophisticated. A yellow silk underdress, the folds and colour can be seen most clearly on her lower legs, with a semi-transparent dress of flowered muslin or perhaps silk gauze worn over it, creating an effect of shimmering silver over gold, with the effect heightened by the gilt ribbons at the waist and shoulders. Her hair is not cut short, but is worn up, held in place by ribbons and combs, with ringlets falling across the forehead and around the face in a manner of carefully judged artlessness. This style, influenced by classical Greek and Roman styles, was highly fashionable in the early 19th century. The Marchesa is full of vitality in this portrait, illuminated by soft light from an undefined source that makes her elegant form glow against its dark background. Her figure is robustly modelled, the forms and volumes that make up her body clearly legible through the flickering brushwork that defines her clothing. Her face, too, is strongly modelled and characterful, animated by a slight smile and the soft, emotion-filled power of her gaze. The overall effect is rich, luxurious, somewhat artificial and remote, but given humanity by Maria Tomasa's warmth and vivacity. I mentioned earlier that the Marchesa is painting with oils. This is a significant point at a time when ladies of high social status who chose to practice painting generally did so in watercolours, which were easy and relatively clean to manage and produced refined results without too much in the way of hard work. By this period, specialist art suppliers sold brushes, canvases, and ready-mixed colours in small bladders, as this was before the introduction of much more convenient metal tubes in the 1830s, freeing artists from some of the laborious tasks that had been necessary in the past, such as making their own pigments. But painting with oils remained difficult and demanding, and required practice, training, and a degree of dedication. This portrait of Maria Tomasa makes it clear how proud she was of mastering painting in oils. She has a brush in her right hand, held as if in use, and a mahl stick to lean on in her left hand. On the table with her palette are other brushes of various sizes, shapes, and lengths, a knife for mixing paints and scraping down the palette, and a small metal vessel for linseed oil. She has a range of colours on her palette, arranged in the order dictated by tradition, with white near the thumbhole and progressively darker shades arranged around the far edge, and vermilion placed separately. The colours represented are of course those that Goya favoured himself. The palette itself would have been made of wood, shaped and sized to fit on the forearm of the painter, and with its surface treated to prevent oil sinking into it. Since the 17th century, the palette had become so important to the status of the painter that it became a symbol of the artistic profession, and Goya emphasizes its importance in the prominence he gives it in this portrait. He also doubly affirms Maria Tomasa Palafox's identity by inscribing her name in the center of the palette, declaring her status not only as a great noblewoman of Spain, but as an artist. This portrait remained in the Marchesa's family and slipped into obscurity. Not until the 1920s was it reassessed by the then director of the Prado, Aureliano di Beruete y Moret, and given its due as one of Goya's most interesting and engaging portraits, ultimately being acquired by the Prado in 1926. Aureliano di Beruete y Moret wrote of this portrait in 1922, "Curious in its composition and arrangement is the portrait of Doña María Tomasa Palafox y Portocarrero, wife of the 12th Marqués de Villafranca. This Doña María Tomasa was undoubtedly an artist. The head, very alive in its expression, the dress, the mastery of the colour, the originality of the composition, everything, in short, makes this portrait an important work of its creator."